Good afternoon, everyone. It really is an honor and a privilege to be up here. I've been looking forward to saying a few things about today's speaker, Dave Cote, who is the chairman and CEO of Honeywell, as you know. I want to first start by welcoming Dave home. In fact, Dave, just about a few blocks away, we have this new area called the Innovation District. It's got some great space for your headquarters if we could get you to relocate back home. Dave was born and raised just over the border in Suncook, New Hampshire, a UNH grad. He is more New Englander than most of us in this room. How many of you in this room owned a commercial lobster boat and commercially fished the coast of New England? I didn't think so. There's only one in the room that's done that, and that's Dave. He may run Honeywell from an office in New Jersey, but he is a tried and true member of Red Sox Nation. His office down there is full of Red Sox jerseys, as I'm told, in addition to his baseball passion. And he said Patriots. Robert isn't here, but Patriots also. Celtics, he includes them all. I also understand he's a big fan of both Harleys and duck hunting. And there's rumors about him being a great shot. So I'm going to be very kind this afternoon in my remarks. I think it's safe to say that we all grew up with Honeywell. The company actually traces its roots back to 125 years ago, a burgeoning furnace regulator business. They created one of the most iconic American products of all times, the round Honeywell thermostat. Now, these things, I still have some in my house, but as you can imagine, as the CEO of Northeast Utilities, which owns 4 electric companies and 2 gas companies, this little puppy is really near and dear to my heart. So I do carry this around with me. 125 years after their humble start, Honeywell continues to touch all of our lives. The planes we fly in many cases, they have their jet engines on it, and in most cases, their advanced avionics are on board. The cars we drive today are probably equipped with their turbochargers that have really revolutionized both the size of our automobile engines and the fuel economy that we enjoy today. And yes, they still are involved in energy and energy efficiency. Now a Fortune 100 company with over 130,000 employees worldwide, including right here in Massachusetts, Honeywell has become synonymous with innovation, the word innovation. It develops and manufactures a wealth of technologies and products that, simply put, help us run our world day in and day out. Over the past 10 years as chairman and CEO, Dave has spearheaded this drive into the 21st century for the company and has done it while significantly growing the company's sales and earnings per share. Since 2003, Honeywell stock has almost tripled from $24 a share to $70 a share, and investors have enjoyed total returns, including dividends, of well over 225%. Last year alone, Honeywell had $38 billion of sales, and Dave once again increased their earnings per share by 11%. In addition to his successful leadership of Honeywell, Dave has also been working hard to make a difference for all Americans. He served and has served on the bipartisan National Commission on Fiscal Responsibility and Reform since 2010, a.k.a. the Simpson-Bowles Commission. As I said to Dave earlier, if only they would have listened to you, we wouldn't be in this situation. He was also named co-chair of the U.S.-India CEO Forum in 2009 and has served on that forum since 2005. In 2011, he was named vice chair of the Business Roundtable and chairs the Business Roundtable's Energy and Environment Committee. That said, it should come as no surprise to any of you that Dave has been honored multiple times, including the Corporate Social Responsibility Award from the Foreign Policy Association, the Peter J. Peterson Award for Business Statesmanship from the Committee for Economic Development, and the Distinguished Achievement Award from B'nai B'rith International. This snapshot of Dave's impressive accomplishments clearly demonstrates why he's the envy of all of us in this room, me more so because he has the Harleys. But like everyone here, I look forward to hearing more about Dave's approach and his strategy for success at Honeywell. So please join me in warmly welcoming Dave to the podium.
Well, having grown up in New Hampshire and having lived in both Saugus and Linfield, and having been a Boston sports fan since the time I was a little kid and you could only watch the Celtics and WSBK on Ghost television up in New Hampshire, it was tough to resist the opportunity to come back to Boston and get a chance to talk because I don't normally do this. So it was really just a unique opportunity. I thought I'd take advantage of it. I can also tell you there has been no better decade to be a Boston sports fan living in New York than this past decade. So for whatever support you gave me to get that done, last year football was a little tough, but we got through it. It's just been a tremendous decade to be there. Now I should take a moment to introduce the Honeywell folks that I brought up from New Jersey with me. So Rob Ferris, Tom Buckmaster, Elena Doom, would you please stand up for a moment? They all came from Honeywell down in Morristown. And I'm identifying you just because I want you all to know what it's like to be the ones with the accent now. Okay, well, I would much rather talk about sports or Honeywell. We're here to talk about the debt. And I know this is unusual, but we left packages of charts at each of your tables. So if you don't mind, that's what I'm going to be talking to. So this ends up being too data-rich for a speech, but I thought the data, the information would actually be useful to you, because I hope in the end to engage all of you in helping us get this done. Because if we don't push on our politicians, this isn't going to happen. So these are some new numbers. The CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, issued new data last night. And if you take a look at this chart, the blue bars represent the actual debt balance. The red line represents that debt as a percent of GDP, which is a common way of looking at how bad is your debt relative to your economy. And you can see that we were in that 35 to 40% range right up to the point where the recession started. The recession and the economic recovery, the Keynesian approach, has taken us to 73% today. And even with the tax actions that were taken at the end of last year, we grow to 87% over the next 10 years. Now, you'll see how that compares to Europe later on, but most economists say that when you're above 60%, you are significantly impacting economic growth, and we're already there. If you go to the next page, just to give you a sense of how that fits into history, the only time our debt as a percent of GDP has been higher has been at the end of World War II. So even though people will complain about the Reagan budgets, for example, and all the deficit spending that occurred and the debt accumulation, it is nowhere near as bad as where we are today, and never mind where we're going to over the next 10 years. So you go to the next page, say, okay, I'm going to take that estimate that I've been given of where the debt is going, and I'm going to revisit some of the assumptions to say how realistic are they. So if you look at GDP growth, you can see in that 12 to 23 range, we're assuming nominal GDP growth of 4.8%, even though this previous decade has been 4. So you could argue, okay, maybe that's reasonable, but what if it's not? Turning to the next page. This gives you a sense for Medicare and Medicaid, and you'll see later on why this is so important. The first line of charts represents Medicare per capita, per person, and you can see the growth rate that's assumed in that next decade is about 2.9%, and you can see that is an all-time low versus what's occurred in the previous 40 years. If you take a look at the next set of charts, the Medicaid, the green bars, you can see on the per capita growth, it assumes about a 4.2% growth per capita. And that looks in line with the previous 20 years. And now if you take a look at Medicare, Medicaid in total, the far right represents total dollars. That is a growth rate of about 5.9%, which is the lowest it's ever been. And we have the Affordable Care Act, which kicks in, and we have the baby boomer generation, my generation, retiring. So it's reasonable to say, okay, that could be optimistic. So maybe it happens, but maybe it doesn't. So if we turn to this next page, it says the debt problem could be even worse than what the CBO is saying. So today, figuring out to 2023, they would say, CBO would say we're going to have about 20 trillion in debt, 77% to GDP. And if we just assume things like, okay, the sequester doesn't happen, the doc fix, which many of you are probably familiar with, where the government imposes a provider payment reduction, and every year the Congress votes to not let that happen. And it's happened something like 13 years in a row, and they've even come up with a name for it. They call it the doc fix because nobody wants to do it. And then the tax extenders that exist largely for companies, if you said, okay, we're going to let those continue rather than take them out, which they've done historically, that adds another 2.6 trillion and gets us to that 87% you saw on the first page. Now, if you just do a little sensitivity analysis and say, okay, so what if GDP just grew at the same rate as it did in the previous decade? And what if Medicare Medicaid spending grows at the same rate as in the previous decade? What does that do? And you can see that takes you up to 110% of GDP. Now, the point of this is not just to alarm people, but rather to say we're not leaving ourselves much room for errors and assumptions. And for any of you who run businesses, you generally tend to look at it and say, I got to leave room for error. Things never work perfectly. They just don't. So how do I make sure I leave myself room? And you would say, right now, we don't seem to have any. So turning to the next page, and you say, okay, so what's the impact of having that much debt? So, okay, I've got 20 to 25 trillion in debt. That means with just a 4 to 5% interest rate, which is not crazy when you look at the long bonds, that says that we end up with $1 trillion a year in interest payments, just annual interest payments. So we're all familiar with millions. Many of us are familiar and deal with billions. So $1 trillion just seems like the next number. And I struggled with this when I was on the Simpson-Bowles Commission with how do you get people's attention about how much $1 trillion is? So I wish I'd come up with this, but my assistant actually found it on Google. So if you turn to the next page, what is $1 trillion? If you had spent $1 million a day, which most people think is a lot of money, if you had spent $1 million a day since Jesus Christ was born, 2012 years ago, you still would not have spent $1 trillion. And that will be our annual interest bill, just the interest. So I find that scary. And as you know, growing up in New Hampshire, where everybody jokes about us, live free or die, at the end of the day, we tended to be pretty fiscally conservative and always thought this was a silly way to run things. And it's one of the reasons I ended up on Simpson-Bowles. Taking a look at the next page, all of us talk about Europe and talk about how silly that situation is. Why can't they do something? Why continue with the excessive spending? So this top set of charts says, okay, if I took that budget deficit, annual deficit percent of GDP, how does that compare with the European countries that we look at and say have trouble? And you end up looking at it and saying, gee, we're about the same as Spain and Greece. We're actually accumulating debt faster than Portugal, France, and Italy. Now you look at the bottom chart and say, okay, what's debt as a percent of GDP compared with those same countries? And if you take a look at the U.S. piece of this, the dark red, the 2011, you can see that our debt is about the same as Spain's, the country that everybody looks at and says is in trouble. Then if you take a look at where CBO says we're going in 2022 and where this thing could go, and you can see we're right in there in the pack with all those countries in Europe that we look at and say, these guys have problems, why can't they do something? We're in the same boat. So we go to the next page. The question usually comes up, so where's the money going? And we've tried to make this pretty simple, and you'll see that in each of those pie charts, the purple pie is pulled aside. And the reason for that is That purple section, that's the only piece of the budget that the Congress votes on. All the rest of this is the stuff that the program is the program, you spend whatever it takes. So if you break that out, you see, okay, interest, you understand, you gotta pay the guys who loaned you the money. Social Security, we all understand the program's the program. Medicare, Medicaid, same thing. Other mandatory, whether it's the pension payments that people have committed to or the health care programs that are in the military. You pull all that together, and it says in 2000, 66% of the budget was devoted to this mandatory spend. That has dropped slightly in this past decade to 64%. It grows to 75% over the next 10 years. So even though our spend almost doubles from $3.5 trillion to 6.2, 3/4 of the money we spend is on autopilot. It is just being spent. There is no control on it whatsoever. The program is the program. Whatever the reimbursement is, the reimbursement is. And if you just did a little math and said, gee, in that 20-year period or so, what's the spend up? It's up about 244%, but that discretionary piece is only up 150. Everything else, that mandatory spend, is up 300. Now, you look at that and start to wonder why, and a big driver of this is just the baby boomer generation is retiring. Everybody in my generation is retiring. And we've made much bigger commitments financially than we can support. And it's as simple as that. And that's what needs to get addressed and is not. All the discussions that are occurring right now, when you think about the sequester or somebody wants to cut the budget somewhere, they're all talking about that discretionary piece. That's the only part that's really being addressed. And this is where you get to, you have to address this mandatory spending. You have to talk about it, or it's going to continue to be a problem. Turning to the next page, what are the assumptions in taxes? This just gives you a sense of where all the money comes from. So this year we'll collect about $2.7 trillion. That'll grow to about $4.9 trillion over the next 10 years. And you can just see the composition of it. The red down at the bottom represents payroll taxes, both employer and employee. The blue is individual income taxes. The purple is all the corporate tax. And then you have the light blue, which is all the other kinds of taxes that exist. So there's a fair amount of money coming in the system at the same time that we're running into this problem. You go to the next page, and it gives you a sense for, so how does this fit in historically, this tax and spend? And this is, I've always found kind of interesting, because this goes back to about 1970, and if you took that red line, it ends up averaging about 18% of GDP gets taken as taxes. Now here's the part that I find interesting, is that if you go back into that kind of 70s time frame, the pre-Reagan tax reform, the highest tax rate was around 70% then. In some cases, 90. If you get back in, after tax reform, you can see where we get more into the 35 or 40% as the top tax rate. But you take a look at the overall revenue collected. It still tends to stay around 18% of GDP because people adjust. And for any of you who remember Ronald Reagan's comment about when tax rates for him were at 90%, what happened when you hit that 90% bracket? You stopped working. There's no sense working anymore. You weren't going to be allowed to keep any of it. So people stop working. People adjust, people adapt. So as we start looking at how do we take this to an even higher rate going forward, we always have to factor in how are people going to behave. And you can see the spend line, there's always been a gap in there. We've been accumulating deficits for a long time. It's just that we've really gotten good at it in these past 5 or 6 years, and we're going to get great at it over the next 10. So turning to the next page, what needs to be done? We really need about a $4 trillion deficit reduction or debt reduction package over the next 10 years. And that's what it would take to put this on a downward path. And we need to be starting to do this now because as the baby boomer generation, mine, retires, while it's painful for Medicare in particular over the next 10 years, it creates an even bigger problem in that second decade. All right, because in the first 10 years, not a lot of medical money ends up being spent. As you start to get into the second and third decades after that, that's when it really hits you hard. Now, the thing that we need to recognize is that something will happen here. and this is the point that we try to make with our politicians a lot, is it's not a case where you can just close your eyes and you're a little less competitive. At some point, something happens here, because at some point, the bond market says, I'm not going to do this anymore. And this is not predictable. You can't say, as many of you know, gee, I've been plotting this, and interest rates have been going up a basis point a week for the last 27 weeks. So as I plot this, our debt crisis happens here. It doesn't work that way. Someday, at some point, the herd turns against you, and now you have a crisis. And all the stuff that you have to do then will look a lot worse than the stuff we have to do today. So the other way to do it, of course, is what we've been encouraging, is to do it thoughtfully, do it proactively, the way a great nation does address its big issues and problems. And so far, we haven't been doing that. At the end of the day, we need both entitlement reform and tax reform. And I've tried to just kind of simplistically lay out some possibilities, but on entitlements, going to a lower inflation rate than what we do today with chain CPI. Longevity has increased substantially, which most of us would say is a good thing. I'm certainly thankful for it. But it also means that you can't have programs that come in as early as they do when people didn't live as long, and it wasn't such an issue. Means testing is one that ends up being important for things like Medicare, not because of the amount of money it generates, because if you just said, okay, I'm going to not give Medicare to anybody who makes over $250,000 a year, you end up saving about $40 billion overall. Okay, I mean, it's not an inconsequential amount, but given that you're looking for $4 trillion, you shouldn't confuse that with a solution. However, psychologically, it's going to be important, right? Because again, they're going to have to feel like any of us who are making any kind of money shouldn't get this. So that's just one of the things I think that'll be done. And one of the things that they ought to be thinking about is how do you hold the growth of this to something like CPI plus 1% or CPI flat? Something where you adjust what you pay afterwards, and there's a bunch of ways they could do that. On the tax reform side, same thing. Our tax system is a mess. And the way I've tried to describe this, there's this physical principle. I've always liked this theory called entropy. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, but it says all organized systems evolve to chaos. We last organized our tax system about 25 years ago, and since that time, entropy has prevailed. We now have, the way I used to say this on the Simpson-Bowles Commission was, if we were working to create a globally uncompetitive, inefficient, unfair system, we could not have done a better job than what we have today. And it's true. If you take a look at companies, we have the highest effective tax rate in the world, but because of all the deductions that exist, we end up paying a much lower cash tax rate. If you take a look at individuals, how many of you end up having to get a tax preparer because it's just too complicated and you couldn't answer a question if somebody came and asked you about it? If you look at the people who receive like the child tax care credit or the earned income credit, this was a statistic that was out about 4 years ago that said the average amount that somebody receives from that credit is about $1,000. But on average, they pay a tax preparer $100 because it's too complicated to get the $1,000 on their own. So we've created a system where we're only giving them $900. It just doesn't make any sense. We should be revisiting this whole thing and just simplifying all of it. Now, that doesn't mean everybody's going to be supportive of the specifics. You can fully expect everybody to say, absolutely. I mean, we've got to simplify the system. But, you know, there's a reason my credit exists. There's a reason mortgage interest exists. And everybody's going to come out in favor of their favorite credit. But at the end of the day, that's a discussion that we need to have because our system's a mess today. And when it comes to companies, another one is if you take a look at the amount of cash that companies have overseas today because you have to pay all your dividends and stock repurchases out of U.S.-based accounts, we're the only big economy in the world that has the system that we have. And I know what the argument is about it encourages jobs overseas. It doesn't. We've got if you're a company like Honeywell, you have to be in these countries. And our system doesn't make any sense. We're hurting ourselves with an economically silly policy. The last point I'd make is the top rate on taxes, in my view, should be the same for individuals, capital gains, and companies. Because right now there's too much work that goes on as people organize their companies to avoid taxes. I mean, that's not a productive use of time. If we had the top rate about the same, it would make everybody's life easier. So if you said, okay, so Dave, what's your potential $4 trillion plan? You think this is easy? What is it? Well, I would say none of it is easy, but here is a way you could do it. And I'm fully expecting that others are going to come up with ideas themselves. But there should be the drawdown for the troops in Afghanistan and Iraq that could be anywhere from $500 billion to and other contingency spending, so like emergency spending, that kind of thing, which I think could be a little aggressive in the CBO budget. And overall, there could be about $1 trillion probably taken out of that over the next 10 years. If you take a look at the next three, those are really, think of it as tax increases. So tax reform, saying broaden the base, lower the rate overall, but you can still end up collecting a little bit more. And by the way, I know everybody wants to say the middle class will not be affected. It's tough to get the kind of tax revenue you need without people in the under $250,000 income range being affected. If you take a look at those Bush tax cuts that everybody likes to talk about, that was about a $4 trillion impact over 10 years. Of that $4 trillion, about $800 billion, came from people making over $250,000. The remaining $3.2 trillion benefited people making less than $250,000. So you can't keep saying that I'm going to increase taxes, but I'm not going to get it for the middle class, because you just run out of places to go for the money. It just doesn't exist. The top quintile today pays about 70% of the overall taxes collected from the government from individuals. It just, you can't keep doing that. It's not going to keep working. But it's another discussion government is loath to have. It doesn't matter which party you're in. Nobody wants to talk about it. Entitlement reform, we actually have ideas that add up to about $2.5 trillion in this Fix the Debt organization that I'm a part of. And we're saying get about half of that. There's probably still some more discretionary spending. And then in that other mandatory, there's a lot of that stuff that is formula-based, where I think you could change the formulas and collect the money. So again, none of this is easy, but it is doable. This is a matter of, do you have the courage to actually make it happen? So this is the curve I would like to see. The red line here represents what happens if we just stay on autopilot the way we are today. And you can see that same 87% in 2023. But because of that second decade impact of the baby boomer generation, particularly in Medicare, it takes you up to 145%. If we were able to get that $4 trillion with some of the entitlement reform that I was just talking about, we could find ourselves finally on a downward sloping path. It's still not at that 60% that most economists would say is the right place to be, no higher than that. But it's a hell of a lot better than where we are today. So it kind of raises the question, so I thought I'd give you a little bit of kind of my own insight here as to why isn't this happening? And I would say, and some of this is from the work I did on Simpson Bowles, getting a chance to talk with a number of the Pauls, plus the work I've tried to do since. But the lack of trust and the lack of relationships between both parties and between the House and Senate really surprised me. You know, when you're seeing an important senator meeting an important House member for the first time, and they're saying hi, you think, well, you know, this isn't right. Or you see Democrats and Republicans that don't socialize together to establish some kind of relationship that they can work together going forward. I mean, the most famous one, coming from here, Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan, they might not have agreed on a lot of things, but they sure found a way to at least be able to be social about it, to be civil about it. And that's not always there today the way it needs to be. Second one, what a difference between what somebody is willing to say in private versus what they're willing to say when there's a camera there. And you probably see this even more than I do, but I was really astounded about the logical relationship that you'd have with 3 or 4 people until the cameras got there. And then everybody would have their prepared kind of statement, here's what I'm going to say, here's what I'm going to do, and they would go ahead and do it. And it was like 2 different people. So anytime I see anybody out there encouraging the discussion has to be in public, we ought to have the cameras there so we know what's going on. So if you want to make sure something doesn't happen, that's what you should encourage. If you want something to happen, you want those private conversations to occur amongst your leaders. Speed and a sense of urgency. I found this one kind of interesting, because when I was first asked to go on Simpson-Bowles Commission, I got this call, and they said, this thing's going to move quickly. And I said, oh, okay, well, not this week, but the week after I have to go to Africa. I've got a long-planned business trip that I have to, am I okay doing that? Yeah, you could probably do that. So I said, okay. So worked for a week, went to Africa for a week, came home for 3 weeks, went to Asia for 3 weeks, came back, we had our first meeting. Said, okay, now I'm getting a sense for what speed is here, and as somebody kind of observed to me, this guy was actually in the Defense Department, an observation about the other departments. He said, Dave, you need to understand here, a successful meeting concludes with agreement to have another meeting. I said, okay, you know, you kind of have to get used to that. I had another one where we got to the end of the meeting, and this kind of gets to the who, what, when. Get to the end of our first committee meeting, and chairman's getting ready to adjourn. And I said, wait, just a moment. What do we do next? Who's going to do what? And the chairman looked at me and said, well, what do you mean? I said, well, if I was into a meeting, I'd say, what are we going to do? When's it going to be done? Who's going to do it? And they all looked at me like I was from outer space. And he finally looked over at me and said, well, send in your suggestions. Boom. Meeting adjourned. Okay, just different way to do things. You're gonna have to learn differently. The 3 H's. This is one I coined because I was really surprised at the nature of the conversation. I said all conversation down here is ruled by the 3 H's: hysteria, histrionics, and hyperbole. Because it was just remarkable how they trot out the words like drastic, draconian, dramatic, and you look at it, and I can remember with the Simpson-Bowles spending reductions, and everybody was talking about how awful they were. So I went through and did a little bit of math myself and said, do you realize that if we do nothing, spending grows at an annual rate of 5%? If we implement Simpson-Bowles exactly as you have it, spending grows at an annual rate of 4%. Yet that was considered drastic, draconian, deleterious to anybody that you could run into, any interest group that was affected. And I just couldn't believe you couldn't really have much of a logical, rational discussion about, gee, we've got a problem here. How do we address it? But there's a lot of interest groups that are just geared towards, okay, this is the reason I exist. This is the reason I live. I'm relevant again. So here I am, and they trot it out. This one I kind of liked. I say probably because I'm from New Hampshire, but I always said growing up in New Hampshire and running companies, what I thought, what I said, what I did, all had to be the same thing. Whereas for those guys, that's 3 separate decisions. Right? What I think isn't necessarily what I'll say. What I say isn't necessarily what I'll do. And what I do isn't necessarily what I think. So it makes it a much more complicated game for somebody like me. Because in the beginning, I can remember, this is a while ago, I can remember going to a meeting with a senator with one of my guys. And we got done with the meeting. The senator said, all right, Dave, I'm with you. Great. You know, so I walked out and I said to my guy, I says, well, that was pretty good. You know, that seemed to go well. And he says, nah, boss, we're screwed. I says, what do you mean? You know, he said he's willing. He said, nah, that's code. He says, you're never going to get that guy. Okay, I guess you do deals differently down here than what I'm used to. Ideology, you've all seen it. It affects it a lot. A number of people, if you talk to Republicans, they're worried about a primary fight on the right. If you're talking to Democrats, they're worried about a primary fight from the left. And there's not enough people worried about how do I win the middle in the general election, right? Because the game is done once the primary is finished. And some would point to the history of redistricting, all that work that's gone on. But at the end of the day, that's something that needs to get addressed. We need a lot more people in the middle. And I've always said 70% of the country is part of that radical middle, like me, who just wants people to get along. Just, you know, I don't want to have to be thinking about what my government's doing all the time. I'd like them to just be able to make this stuff happen and be smart about it. I don't want to have to spend my time thinking about it all the time. The last one, fear voters. They really are scared to death of voters. And getting back to this primary challenge idea. And as a result of that, and this fear from the right, fear from the left, What you get too often is a feeling that compromise is a synonym for caving in. And the message that needs to be coming from voters to everybody is compromise is a synonym for governing. That's how you get along and get something done. We still expect our politicians to govern and not just spend all their time arguing. So what can you do? First one I'd ask you to do is, you're probably familiar with this Fix the Debt organization that we have. We've accumulated about 400,000 signatures at this point with people saying to their politicians, do something to fix the debt. I would ask you to please just sign on to that. It's very easy to do. Just sign on and support that they need to do this. The second one is this doesn't work unless politicians are fearful of what their voters will do to them. So the fear of doing nothing has to exceed the fear of doing, has to be supplanted by the fear of doing, other way around. The risk of doing nothing, which has historically been the concern, that has to get to a point where their greater fear is that if they don't do something, something bad happens. And the only way they get that is from you. If all of you as voters are in there telling them, look, you need to get something done, compromise. If you're the Democrat, you have to say, look, I understand the need for entitlement reform, go do it. If you're the Republican, you have to say, look, I understand if you want entitlement reform, there's going to have to be some taxes in here. Do it. Just get the thing done. And the amounts of money that these guys argue about is incredible sometimes. You know, they'll argue about the impact of $200 or $300 billion in taxes over 10 years. And you would say, well, wait a minute, $200 or $300 billion, that's a lot of money. That's not inconsequential. But if you say, well, wait a minute, that's on collections of about 30 trillion during that time. Well, you know, it's not quite as big a deal anymore. And maybe you guys ought to just go ahead and get that done, and then we can move on to the next agenda item. Because the point that I've tried to make on why this is a time to pull together rather than to pull apart, if we take a look at the global economy, 20 years ago, there were about 1 billion active participants in the global economy. You had the US, Western Europe, Japan, and a few other countries. Only about 1 billion people. Today, we have about 4 billion people participating in the global economy. Because now you've got China, India, Russia, other CIS states, other countries who have recognized that the private sector is the route to prosperity. All these countries are moving. And as mentioned before, I mean, Honeywell's a $38 billion company. 54% of our sales are outside the US. So in this job, I've gone to about 100 countries over the last 10 years. When I go to these places, they're moving. They're trying to figure out how to be more competitive. Instead, we sit here arguing about our debt. We need to address debt, energy, math and science education, infrastructure, free trade, and I always call it a more comprehensive and nuanced relationship with China, tort reform. All these things need to get addressed. And instead, we're still arguing about debt. We're still acting like we did 20 years ago, and we're not waking up to the fact that we're in a different global economy than we were. Now, I would say having 4 billion people thinking about how to make things better is a good phenomenon. It's a good phenomenon for the world. But it also means at the same time, we need to think about how do we become more competitive as a country. And this is just the first step. We need to resolve this, stop arguing about it, and start moving on to the other things that are going to make us competitive as a country. So all your help is appreciated. And like I said, this is a time for us to pull together, not to be pulling apart. Thanks.
Dave has time for 2 quick questions. We've got a first one over here. Wait for the microphone, please.
Let's see, I'll come over here. Can you? It is working. First of all, thank you for coming this afternoon. I'm wondering if you see Honeywell increasing its presence at all in Massachusetts in terms of the workforce.
Well, you're not going to like my answer here, because I would say Massachusetts I have not found to be the most friendly state to do business in. And at the end of the day, there's a lot of lawyers here. And they seem to, and I've never seen a government that was so full of lawyers. So, no. I'd say I don't have a lot of plans to do that. I have not found it to be a business-friendly state. I can see Rick Lord and Al McDonald already starting to send me emails saying, here's what you don't understand, Dave. But at the end of the day, I've had some horrible experiences in Massachusetts so far. That's not why I came to talk about that, but you hit my New Hampshire candor hot button with that one.
So Dave, I got, is this on?
Yes.
Okay. David? Oh,
Another question over here?
Tom. Mr. May?
Where am I looking?
Oh, right.
Oh, Al. Oh, there is. Like I said, I knew Al or Rick would be up in a moment.
So, Dave, so this is an economic growth question, but it's for the country, not just Massachusetts. But as you say, our companies have to be global, have to be in other countries. Right. And those countries that we are comparing ourselves to on the debt circumstance are talking about growing their own economies more. And we have a national news network that does a lot of Made in America shows and Buy in America. This is the solution. We have to grow our economy here by buying American products. Now, I know we need to be international, so how do you see these Made in America, Buy in America programs as being any help for this?
Yeah, I've never been a big fan of those because I think all that ends up doing over time is encouraging inefficiency. And I've always thought, at the end of the day, standard of living is driven by productivity. Standard of living in our country is terrific because our productivity is terrific. And standard of living between countries are driven by levels of productivity. The reason that we live better than everybody else is our productivity is better than everybody else. Anything that discourages productivity, in my view, is generally a bad thing. And when we do something like Made in America, if we're saying buy it Made in America, even if it costs you more, okay, that sounds patriotic. It sounds like you're doing the right thing in the beginning. People will like you for it. But at the end of the day, are you really making the country better, or are you just buying time because somebody isn't working to be as productive as they should be to be able to compete the way they need to in the world today? And I think it's one of those things where, yeah, you know, it looks like you're being kind, like you're being patriotic, but at the end of the day, you're doing the absolute wrong thing for the country because you're not facing into the issues that you have. Now, I would say when it comes to defense stuff, then you've got a different argument because you don't want to find out that you're sourcing a key component from a country that doesn't like you anymore, right? So your plane doesn't fly. Okay, that's a problem. But in general, that's not what we run into.
One last question over.
I can see my communications leaders already saying, oh, God, why does Dave say this stuff?
Sir, yesterday the President proposed a short-term budget fix, temporary, to postpone or delay the sequester or the budget. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I'm of a different view on the sequester because I'm concerned enough about the long-term impact of the debt that I've looked at it and said, I think they have, really as a government, they have three choices. The first one is to just let the sequester happen. The second one is to kick the can down the road again, like they did at year end for a couple of months, and just buy some more time. The third one is to get that same $1 trillion reduction, but to do it in a thoughtful, kind of considerate way so that you make sure that what you're doing makes sense. After watching this for 3 years, I'd say that third option is not a real option. It's just not going to happen. We can tell them to do it. They can have an agreement to do it. They're not going to do it. So I kind of look at it as we're stuck with two choices. One is we either let it happen or we don't let it happen at all. And if I have to pick one of those two, I'd say we're better off getting that $1 trillion in debt reduction and getting everybody focused on tax reform and entitlement reform, which they have to do. Because once this happens on the discretionary side, there isn't a lot more left to do there. You saw the spending profile. That's where all the defense spending, Homeland Security, all that other stuff, parks, all that stuff is in there. So they're going to be forced to go to entitlement reform and tax reform, which is what they need to do. So while you could argue it'll have some slight impact on economic growth this year, my view is that it's more than overshadowed by the benefits you get in 14, 15, and beyond by at least having another $1 trillion of debt reduction.